right, well, it's 10:05. I think we'll go ahead and get started this morning. Thank you all for joining us on our September 3rd Thursday web forum. My name's Hillary Morris. I work on Blueprint User Support and Communications for the South Atlantic LCC, and we host this web forum every third Thursday of the month right here at 10 a.m. To help give folks a chance to ask any questions and provide input to help guide the conservation future of the South Atlantic. So we have a little bit of a more fluid agenda today since we'll be pausing for questions and some participatory exercises throughout Rua's talk. Afterward, we'll preview next month's webinar and we'll hear a few updates from LCC staff and then pause for more questions and discussion. A few logistics. If you're a frequent attendee of our web forums, I do typically mute people during the presentation to avoid background noise, but since we're going to be having more participation today, I just ask that everyone please be diligent about muting yourselves and not putting the webinar on hold so that we all are treated to the beautiful elevator music. Thank you for that. And then we will be using the chat box throughout the hour today, so please remember to send the note to everyone if you're responding to a question so we can all see what everyone's responses are. So before I hand things off to Rua this morning, does anyone want to speak up with questions, comments, or concerns? I did see a question from Sarah about putting the passcode up again. Do you mean the passcode for the phone line? I'm backing back up here to the first slide. So hopefully we're good on the passcode. So going back, I guess I'll hand it off to Rua here.
All right, excellent. Hello, everybody. I'm going to share the screen real quick. All right. Time to talk about the updated Blueprint implementation strategy. So, plan today is going to be, I'm going to do an overview, a little background first, and then an overview of the sections of the current draft strategy that we sent out, mentioned in the newsletter, and went out for this webinar. Talk about the different sections, and then we'll have some chances for questions and pauses in between those. And then we're going to talk a little bit about prioritizing different types of actions after that as well. So should be fun. First, some quick background. The previous version of the Blueprint implementation strategy have been very simple, really focused around this idea of support, improve, and promote. And so support meaning using the Blueprint to facilitate and prioritize specific conservation actions. So these are things like trying to use the Blueprint to bring in new resources through grant proposals, integrating the Blueprint into organizational policy, clearing barriers, those kind of things. Improve, meaning strengthening underlying science and interfaces to make the Blueprint more useful. So that's updating some of the methodologies, targets, the online interfaces, so kind of making it stronger on the technical side. And then promote, spreading awareness and building knowledge about the Blueprint and how to use it. So this is just letting people know about it and giving smaller presentations, organizational inreach. So this is not just stuff that your staff here at the cooperative is doing, but also some things like that a number of you have started doing is you spreading the word about the Blueprint and the cooperative. So they've been fairly simple, but we've been getting a lot of requests for more details and specifics from Blueprint users. Okay, well, we want a little bit more on how this integrates with how we get from these actions to improving the ecosystems and a little more specificity around actions. So that's what has brought together this kind of next update, providing a little more detail in the implementation strategy.
It sounds like someone might have maybe put the call on hold or something. I may go ahead and put us in silent mode just to take that beeping off. Sorry, everybody.
Take care of that.
The conference is now in silent mode.
Sorry, everyone. So that means if you do want to speak up while we're in silent mode, you'll have to hit *6 to unmute your line. But moving right along.
Cool.
Back to you, Rua.
Cool. Sounds like that took care of the beeping. And then, when we open it up for questions, we'll take you out of silent mode. All right. So that leads us to these different sections of the current implementation strategy. So the first part of it is actually talking about using the blueprint to improve ecosystem integrity. So this is this general overview sort of logic model, something that folks that were at the Blueprint Workshop will probably remember. So we start with these inputs of active involvement in the cooperative, like the time y'all are spending on this forum right now. Staff and operational capacity and sort of dedicated time and space to help facilitate some of these things. And then project funds from different organizations to target key science gaps. So those are some of the key inputs coming in. And then, of course, we want to get to these ultimate impacts of improving ecosystem integrity because, if we're not actually leading to improvements, then we're not really doing our job. So then connecting those inputs to the activities. So this is that support, promote, improve framework that we've been operating on for the last few years, and that a number of you that were Blueprint Workshop voted on some of the allocation for next year. So those are our activities. Then moving to the outputs themselves, including Blueprint making proposals more competitive, individuals using the Blueprint to guide their work, and organizations as a whole using the Blueprint to guide their work. So there's some outputs from those activities. And then finally, the outcomes we're hoping are changing the integrity itself. One, bringing new resources to implement conservation, places we already know where to go, but money and resources are the limitation. And also more efficient use of the current resources we have right now, working together and adding up our efforts in a way that we hadn't been able to do before. So this is this overall conceptual path that we've been working on for the last few years, but have never really officially codified in any kind of strategy or document. So this is that's the part including that path to ecosystem integrity. One thing that you don't see in, one other thing, these are the components that it's measured by. So the idea here is not to just have this big conceptual model of outcomes, but make sure we're actually getting those outcomes and adding value. Sort of the cooperative wasn't here, making sure we're focusing on those things that would not have happened without the cooperative, without the blueprint, that kind of thing. So been working on tracking and get real life data on all these different components, including the things leading up to it, but also working on tracking the ecosystem score change through the grades and the indicators in the state of the South Atlantic and the endpoint. So one thing you do not see in this implementation strategy is some of the back-end stuff we've been working on to try to put real data to use. And that's something we're doing in a program called Analytica. The visual tool for analyzing decision models get used by Army Corps, EPA, a ton of big companies use this tool. And it's nice because it has both powerful features, but also easy ways for non-experts to try to use the models themselves. So we've been working on building out this simpler model in more realistic and real data-driven approaches. So this is one of the draft blueprint models in Analytica. Looks very much similar. We're trying to use the same words and pieces. And what you'll see is, particularly right now, these dark blue highlighted boxes are actually submodels. So each of this working through data. So if you zoomed in on, say, number of blueprint users, this box, there are submodels underneath there. And then each of these, going from users to your potential users, how many people actually use it based on things like, did you know about it? How easy was it to use? And how good was it? Was it up to the quality? And each of those boxes then specifies the relationship and the numbers and the input. So we're really basically working towards driving that bigger conceptual model with real data. And so we can start looking at impacts and doing some weather scenarios. So here's an example of an interface that we can do in Analytica where theoretically we put in different levels of, percent of our resources to support, promote versus improve, and look at potential impacts of those different ones, how many new funds, how many new actions in different areas. So the numbers are pretty rough estimates right now, but just to get it to work, but we're now working on building in real numbers for each of these different steps so we can really quantify the impact and then use it eventually to also bring it back to all y'all. So when you're prioritizing efforts and looking at options, we can see what the data are also telling us about our impacts. So that's that more detailed stuff is not necessarily in the implementation strategy, but seemed like a good excuse to tell you about cool stuff under the hood that we're working on. All right, so before I go into this next section about urban growth and sea level rise, Hillary is going to take us out of silence.
The conference is now in talk mode.
So we're now in talk mode. You're not silenced anymore. And so I just wanted to pause there real quick to see if anyone had any questions about this overall path for improving ecosystem integrity and this first section of the strategy. So chat box or just speak up over the phone, either way. Give you a few seconds to think about it.
Sorry, we don't mean to be crickets on you.
Okay.
Not a problem. All right, I think we'll move on. We'll have other chances to discuss things before, but just wanted to get anyone a chance to say some things. All right, so that was the path, the blueprint to ecosystem integrity. The next piece that you included was the response to urban growth and sea level rise in the strategy. So this came up a lot, and this is some stuff that some of you may remember, some of you may not remember from some of the earlier processes. So in general, the idea of the blueprint is having this collective impact. How do we have these mutually reinforcing activities? What we found fairly early when we started to talk about urban growth and sea level rise is there's a lot of different philosophies about how to address change and how to address urban growth. And it's not necessarily even an organization by organization thing, it's more an individual kind of piece. And so we found a lot that there was this spectrum from folks that were like, whoa, man, these urban areas are growing. We got to get to the good spots quick before they're gone, all the way to the, woo, this urban area is growing. We got to get the heck away from it and get away from the areas that aren't going to go anytime soon. And so it was fairly interesting in some early Blueprint 1 workshops that we realized that we really are going to have to think about maybe a weighted allocation across the strategies instead of just a simple black and white 0-1 approach to some of these changes. It's a little more nuanced when you get there in practice. So we did an exercise in Blueprint 2.0 for those that were there, looking at potential strategies for change and tried to put some things along this gradient of what we call higher urgency. These are the places that are changing and maybe we should work more there, all the way down to lower risk. Like, oh boy, let's get away from those places that are changing. So we had this gradient of different strategies. Baseline was a case-by-case basis. I'm going to go in either. So we looked at those. We had a hybrid approach too, high urgency sea level rise, but low risk urban. In an ideal world, we would have done the other hybrid. We learned that a little too late through our back and forth of what we do and how to keep things simple. But this gave us a good first cut across the big hundreds of people in the conservation community along the strategies for change. What should our allocation look like? And we put the strategies map out, which was Blueprint 2, and we overlaid just Blueprint priority areas that could potentially be urban by 2050, which is the yellow, or could transition due to sea level rise from one habitat type to another by 2050, and that's in the blue. And so we had not just theoretically ask people about the question, but let's go to some of those places that are more tangible, that are potentially impacted, and then have people vote based on actually looking at the places that would be at stake. So this is really a chance to kind of get a sense of those. And so a high urgency is like, we're going to work more in these yellow and blue places that are already a priority within the blueprint. Baseline, I'll keep them in, but I'm not going to put them higher prioritized. There's hybrid, just work away from the urban places, and then the low risk. Anything that's predicted to change but is still high priority, get out of the blueprint. I don't want to see it. And so I want to give it a chance to figure out where that sentiment was at and what the balance looked like. So here are the strategy votes that came out of that workshop. And so what's interesting, the blue is the lower risk, and that's the only one that says don't include the places predicted to change in the blueprint. And the rest of them, red being hybrid, yellow baseline, green higher urgency, basically we're saying, oh, actually we think it's important to continue working in some of these places that are changing. So instead of, now if this had looked 90% lower risk, we may have just, highly down-weighted places predicted to change in the blueprint. But it depends on the action and different strategies and what your organization does and your different roles. And so instead, we decided to sort of take a look at these and say, well, right now in the blueprint, let's think about it more as this allocation, and we're not going to just remove places that are predicted to change. Now, some of them do get penalized a little bit, like, in the resilient biodiversity hotspots. If a place is going to be inundated by sea level rise, it's not a resilient biodiversity hotspot. So there are some indicator implications, but in general, you still see it in the blueprint. And so we tried to talk about this allocation in the implementation strategy as well. That is the approach to urban growth and sea level rise currently in the blueprint. So I will pause again. Chat box or questions, if anyone has any thoughts or questions on the approach to urban growth and sea level rise.
Rua, this is John Faustini. This is great, and I guess what my question, I have a question, well, I guess the question first, which is, so you're taking these essentially different strategies, and then you're using them to kind of weight the prioritization for the blueprint. Is that?
Not right now. So originally we thought if it was really a massive landslide vote on one side or another, we might weight them, but we decided because of this sort of more of a different sort of balance, it wasn't sort of 99% do one thing, that we would not weight the blueprint at all based on those. But what we're working on right now is actually looking at this percentage allocation of actions and a few other allocations and modeling them out into the future and look at the indicator outcomes and try to see what are the pluses and minuses of if we spent more time than, so we're assuming this is sort of like a sample of the current approach.
Right.
This is about how people are working. And then we will use this to say, okay, this is business as usual. What are the winners and losers on the ecosystems and indicators? And if we weighted it higher here or here, what would we gain and what we'd lose, and then bring that back to the larger cooperatives, and then maybe we may change and do some formal weighting into the blueprint. For right now, it doesn't get touched by that, but in the future, that's the idea. Come back on the implications of different weightings, and then talk about it as a group, and then we can decide whether we want to change that.
Okay, great. So actually, because one of the things I was thinking about is that another way that this kind of information could be used is that you would essentially use the blueprint more dynamically, and depending on the strategy or the area that you work. So if you have a group that works with engaging people with nature, they might focus more on the urban areas. So that you have different strategies, and you would have a different prioritization and a different blueprint of where you want to focus your efforts based on what that strategy is or your overall goal, as opposed to trying to sum everything up into one blueprint that kind of averages everything out.
Yeah, that's what one of the things we did look into some of and continue to work on that sort of, splitting out the actions and pieces as far as if there's logical places for one thing to happen. Most of the ways people use the blueprint at this point is the sort of the big giant, here's the everything, here's all the ingredients. And in general, most folks then, depending on their mission and pieces, will usually grab one part of that versus another. So that's the kind of thing that, depending on the organization, depending on the question, we might organize it more for their own interests. But I think that's another good future development is overall, maybe we want to say, well, what's the allocation for these types of actions? Well, maybe more, like you said, education. That was the other thing we struggle with, some of the education components where it may happen in an area that's not a blueprint priority, but impacts the blueprint priority. You need to go to Atlanta to get some of the landowners that are out in the rural areas, that are impacting some things. So that's the second thing we're working on the blueprint, where the actions are spatially separate for where the benefits go. So yeah, that's another good tie into that piece. Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
We have a question from the chat box. In this decision making, which stakeholders were at the table? Did it include developers, realtors, private landowners, ecologists, etc.? So these votes came from the Blueprint 2.0 workshop series that happened back in 2015. And so we had, roughly 200 people from more than 50 organizations at that workshop series. Was probably more heavily weighted toward natural resource professionals on the conservation side. But there definitely were representatives of lots of different sectors: federal, state, nonprofit, private. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so we did have some private companies, and we did have some folks from urban planners and worked in urban conservation. But this would definitely, as far as developer realty goes, I would view this as a conservation community kind of vote, because even the folks that were from, say, local governments, they were often from the open space groups, or they were conservation-minded urban planners. So I think, as far as a strategy for the conservation community, that's probably a reasonable, not perfect, but a reasonable cut at it. But as far as an overall percentage of effort for other sectors, then I think you have less of that ability to represent it in that way.
Great question. Another question about with Hurricane Matthew, Hurricane Harvey, thinking about the impact of development on flooding and property buyouts. So Diana was wondering about the potential to promote the use of the blueprint as local governments look at development and conservation decisions they might be facing.
I love how you asked that question, because 2 days ago we were in the Upper Waccamaw Task Force group, which included a number of folks from county and local government. And it was, and that exact thing was coming up of using sort of the flood and especially the new updated flood maps, because they're using some of the floods and hazards intersections specifically for some of the conservation intersections. And that group and a lot of folks around the table were very interested and seemed fairly comfortable with the latest version of the blueprint being maybe that bigger landscape context that they use in this. So I think there is certainly interest in that as we get closer to some of the hazards, and have had some discussions with some of the folks that do work more on the hazard side to better integrate this into some opportunities, filter down the blueprint using these flood zone areas and look at opportunities. But it seems, just like you said, it's a very active thing that a lot of the urban communities and people in the conservation world are trying to promote from a flood protection perspective, even down to doing some of these numbers about look at the blueprint and do some of these what ifs, hey, if we converted this to flood protection, here's how much money you would save for insurance payouts for people that, would have been living in this floodplain, because we have urban growth models, so we can sort of do some of these what ifs, how much money would you save if this is in conservation for floodplain management versus, how much you'd have to pay for hazards.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there. Great intersection to get people out of harm's way, save government's money, get some great impacts for conservation as well.
And there's some of those actions actually in the sub-regional strategies in this implementation plan right now.
Yeah.
Excellent point.
Well, for time, do you suppose you want to move on to the next, and we'll continue to pause through for questions as we go forward.
Yeah. So the last piece is this actions by subregion part. So what I'm going to do here, these are, there's 7 subregions in the South Atlantic. Most of y'all are somewhat familiar because this is generally how we break up in the different groups, including the marine. And so what we did in this version, this updated version, is we took a couple of components. The first is what success and failure looks like in that subregion. So y'all that were at the workshop would remember those very questions. And so we pulled sort of 10 particularly representative statements from each of those categories and used them in the sub-regional action. Then we also pulled information from the most recent and past blueprint workshop on actions and information from 19 other plans, including coastal resource plans, wildlife action plans, a ton of different various partnerships and local planning. And so we integrated those together into a longer catalog of sub-regional actions. So I'll show you an example of one, and just in case you have a chance to go through all the full giant 67-page document, most of which, about 2/3 of it is made up of some of these actions in the sub-region. So I'll give you an example here, just to orient yourself. This is the Gulf Coastal Plain. So I'll give you an example from there. And we'll go down here. So your first section, what does success look like? So you have some of these statements about integrated landscapes of restoring longleaf, hydrologically connected coastal salt marshes, a lot of components of broad public understanding and support for conservation. So some of these things are things that come out as themes across a lot of the regions, and some of them are specific containment of urban sprawl to urban service regions. We had some urban planners in that group, so they had some good specifics. And some of them are more specific to the subregion themselves, talking about specific corridors linking different conservation lands, and some of the grasses and other components. So we've got those parts of success, and then we have the what failure looks like. So you're in the beautiful Big Bend of Florida, and failure is seawalls end to end along the coast. Harmful algal blooms, manatee access to the springs you can't make it because of low river levels. Or one of my favorites will look like South Florida, Orlando, or Jacksonville, which is, again, these are very visual and frightening, what failure looks like statements. So we have some of those different pieces, and then you have the actions. So documented, each of the subregions has a different collection of plans. So we're in the Gulf, so we have some things related to Gulf restoration in addition to wildlife action plans. In the Gulf in particular. You move to other places, you see other things, the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor Plan and other mixes. So what we have is it's organized by the open standards for the practice of conservation actions taxonomy. We've been using those for a number of years. This is the updated version that we're using. And so we classify them all by these different categories: so land water management, education and awareness, livelihood, economic incentives, those pieces. So this is basically what they end up looking like. You have specific things from the blueprint workshop, like managing forest cover to improve hydrologic flow and recharge. So that came from the blueprint workshops. But you also have components, for example, from the Georgia SWAP to assess exotic plant populations on public and provide technical assistance to private landowners to discourage use of invasive plants. So some of them are fairly broad, some of them are fairly specific, like in the Alabama SWAP, calling out specific dams to address. So that's about what these different sections, and you've got a broad range of different types of conservation actions, a lot around flow and conservation measures, and things like support gear conversion and removal of derelict fishing gear to remove impact of ghost fishing, this kind of thing. So that's what you get in some of the management pieces. We have species management, so that's talking more about individual specific species. So flathead catfish removal is a good example from the blueprint workshop. So pretty good swath of different types of actions from the full suite of toolkits we have right here. So that's trying to capture both where they originally came from as a resource for context, but also put them all together in that bigger suite of actions, pretty much all of which some folks are already working on in this broader region. So that is these sub-regional actions. And like I said, about 2/3 of this document is that capturing of the different sub-regional actions. And we tried for balance to make sure we had a good balance across aquatic, terrestrial, bringing in cultural, bringing in a different range of plans, and tried to incorporate any ones that people had along the line suggested be included. All right, so open that up again here for thoughts and questions about the sub-regional actions component of this document.
This is Diana. I was typing, but I'll go ahead and just say one of the actions was to discourage rebuilding in high-risk coastal areas. I'm paraphrasing. How exactly were they looking at discouraging rebuilding in high-risk coastal areas?
See what.
We'll have to scroll down and find exactly where that was.
That might have been the.
It was a Florida swap or something like that.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's a good question. Actually, Beth, are you on the line?
I am. Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
So the question was related to, it was actually in the Florida swap.
Which I'm sure you have memorized.
Of
Yeah.
course, I know page by page. That's why I was distracted with. Somebody sent me an exact quote from the CLIP technical report, and they wanted to know which page it came from. I'm like,
well, we're putting you on the spot, too.
So basically one of the actions in there, well, you don't really need to know the swap in and out, but I think one of the questions was, one of the actions in the swap was to try to discourage rebuilding in high-risk coastal areas. And the question was, what were some of the specific, were there some specific ideas or approaches that were under consideration for how to do that?
probably not in the State Wildlife Action Plan. They may have had some additional general statements, but a lot of that's going to come down to beyond natural resource policy. It's going to have to, go to obviously to the county level or city, the city planning level, or make it to, other states. I think have tried to remove, well, if you're going to rebuild, we won't pay for flood, you can't get flood insurance, and try to discourage it through alternative means. But still, there's things like that out there but I don't know what Florida actually has. It would, again, probably vary by county or city or municipality. I don't think there's anything statewide. It would be nice if we could get that happening. Maybe with more, unfortunately, maybe that could be one positive spin if there is anything from all these storms, is maybe it'll finally encourage some sort of policies on, just no, you're not going to rebuild.
Yeah, the issue we've had up here our way is that, one, developers want to, and two, the localities want it because of tax base.
Yep.
Those are high tax properties.
Right, and typically the folks that can afford to rebuild there, the fact that they can't get the flood insurance to cover their rebuilding isn't always a problem for the ones that will keep coming back. The ones that can't keep coming back are the ones that aren't so wealthy and can afford to take the hit. So, yeah, it is. It's an economic issue more than anything, because it brings in, tourist dollars and visitors and the tax base. So I have no answer other than I hope something's done, and maybe again some of these storms will really push that forward.
Yeah. So it sounds like the intent, if I'm getting it right, that on that one is not necessarily that there's a very specific program to do that, but more of when say staff from the different organizations are sitting at the table with their sort of local counties or on various boards or kind of cross-sectoral things, look for ways to discourage the rebuilding. So at least speaking up and advocating for things that and approaches from other organizations and agencies that.
Right, and definitely be at the table. So if policies are changed or developed, that we're at that table and maybe thinking, well, if they institute some sort of setback, the default may be some engineering to protect wherever those things do go, and having natural resource folks in the room and making sure at the table can maybe encourage living shorelines or less structurally modified shorelines that can still have wave reduction capacity but not be so harmful to the habitats and species. So yeah, definitely be engaged in making sure those kinds of folks are at the table if and when policy discussions are happening.
We've got two more really good questions from the chat box that I want to make sure that we have time for. One from Sarah Schweitzer: were bird conservation plans incorporated? For example, Partners in Flight, Land Bird Conservation Plan, U.S. Shorebird Conservation Plan, North Atlantic Waterfowl Management Plan. And I'll put that to you, Rua.
Yeah, we did pull in the ones that had specific enough types of action. So like the here we are, and they're all sort of linked. So like here is the North and South Piedmont, and you have the Piedmont Bird Conservation Region Implementation Plan that pulled in. So we kind of tried to pull in where we had stuff for that particular region, and it was new enough. And those were actually really nice because they brought in some of the more grassland and prairie associated and some other components that weren't necessarily always captured by the other plans. So we pulled in ones. We got a list of some other ones that we didn't actually have specific actions from, but had goals and other things. So the idea is that we could continue as we get sort of newer pieces to implement various other parts. So we tried to pull those in where we could when they had specific sort of actions in the strategy plan. But there's a few more on my list that I'd like to over time start filtering in. So excellent question.
Might be some other good ones for looking at in the future
yeah.
on that list. And then another one from Pace Wilbur. I really like this. Have the actions identified in the plan been ground truth? So, for example, the city mills and the Eagle Phoenix dams are already removed. So I would have to kind of do a quick find to figure out where those dams are referenced. I'm wondering if those came from
Alabama,
a workshop?
Alabama swap.
Oh, from the Alabama
yeah.
swap. So that might be outdated.
Yeah, and I think that's a good, that can be a good follow-up for these ones that are fairly specific and actually not too hard to do. Because some of those things, like you said, those dams are fairly specific. So I think what we can do is, one follow-up is we can go through and pull out things that are fairly specific places and pull out the ones that are already done.
Yeah.
So I'll pull that piece out.
And Sarah Gottlieb reminds us that CCAP is tracking dam removals and could be a good resource for looking at
those are
data.
Good ones for specific pieces. And that connects with another project we were just working on for connectivity.
And I might also say that this review process in itself is actually really helpful for us to ground truth those things. So now we know that those dams are out. So that's definitely something that we hope to get out of this review process, is information on which of these actions are most relevant and should be the focus.
And that'll help us we can do some proactive validation too. So I'll volunteer to go back through and where there are specific places or things called out that could be time dependent, because most of these plans are, I don't think we have anything that's more than 3 years old, but a lot of things can happen in just 3 years. So yeah, I'll go back on that one and then can go and just ground truth a few of the ones that are specific enough that could have happened. It's a great point.
Anybody else want to jump in with a question? Awesome.
Cool. All right, I will go back to the very last piece here. So the last part I wanted to talk about, actually, no, we've got, let's go ahead and pause and do the poll here.
All right.
So one of the things we were thinking about is just to get a sense of the crowd, and we can talk about this later. We're going to do a quick poll, which will pop up I don't know why it's asking me to save the poll question. So we're going to pop up a quick poll here to see if the current draft of the strategy looks good enough for version 1. Something that we, will continue to update, maybe yearly, maybe before that. And I would say before you answer, the caveat is, I think we clean up a few things, like clean it up, do the ground truthing on some of these specific actions that Pace is looking for. So, after a few of those tiny tweaks, just wanted to get a sense of the group for a first version of this. Yes, it's basically good enough with a couple of tweaks. Not sure, haven't dug into it more. I want to look a little more, or not quite yet. Needs more work on some big things. So we're just going to take a quick poll here. We got another minute or so to think on it, and so we'll get a sense of the group to see where it's at, and that'll give us a chance to kind of foster some discussion. And again, for those of you that don't like to be put on the spot in a conference and want to chew on things some more, you're all good. Just say a no sure, and you can follow up later.
Yep. Looks like we've got about 50% of the responses in, about 30 seconds left on the poll. 5 seconds.
Oh,
Go, 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 go.
very dramatic.
Oh, should have brought the final countdown to play as our dramatic soundtrack for that moment.
Yeah,
Okay.
Much better than Jeopardy, I think. Final countdown.
So I'm going to make sure that everyone gets to see it, and I'm trying to figure out how to do that. So we are sharing the poll results, which hopefully everyone can now see.
Yeah. Okay. So we got a few folks multitasking over there, and looks like we've got a good split of like, yeah, I think it's good enough, and some not sure's. But no, not yet, just yet. So what I would say is for folks that are not sure, and if you want to just take a little bit more time to think about it, follow up with questions, read, go for it. That'd be great. You can follow up later with any other questions or components that you want. And so it sounds like we got a pretty good sense of where this current version is.
Yep. Great.
So I'm going to move on to this next section, and we can always do other questions afterwards.
So I got to get the presenter power back to you, Rua. I had to take it back to do the poll.
Oh, interesting. Makes sense.
Yeah. So you now have the power again.
Sweet.
And take it away.
All right. So one more little section here, which is going to be next question about, okay, we have this, captured. We'll keep improving some of the ground truthing of the actions, and also trying to fold in some other plans you may be missing. By the way, if you have any other specific plans, if you're reviewing it and you see in that big list of plans, you're like, oh, I also think this would be helpful, or you have some ideas of things that'll be helpful, even if you haven't looked through the plan, feel free to send them along. We can go scope them out and see if we can bring in the actions in the plans. So potential blueprint approaches now. All right, so we have this big, wide set of tools that are all, actively being used across the whole geography. And the question here, strategically, just kind of want to get your sense on, is the approach to all those different types of actions in here. And we've given you 3 kind of strategies to chew on how to deal with that large set of different types of actions in the subregion. And so the question is, should we broadly, as sort of a cooperative and with blueprint support in those pieces, strive to support that full range of actions more equally? Try to make sure there's about an equal amount of effort and resources and stuff to the, to each different component of the sort of land water management, education outreach, try to spread out and get a good little piece of everything, more than we've been doing now. Should we do the current approach? And the current approach right now has been a mix of proactive outreach when it seems like there's an opportunity for new resources for conservation or a really good fit for the blueprint, and responding to requests for help regardless of what action in that broader strategy. So it doesn't matter if you're doing education outreach, if you're doing planning, if you're doing land water management, if you're doing protection, whatever your piece is, we'll help find a use for the blueprint and how it can help. Or we'll try to find a way for it to help you. Or an increased focus. Focus more on a few specific types of actions. And when requests or things happen for other types of actions, maybe we put less effort or no effort towards those in order to concentrate on a few specific types. So these are just a few different options. And to give you a sense of what that might mean, here's some broad types of actions where the blueprint has helped so far. So I'm not talking about the big star at the top. I'm talking about only the blueprint itself and not the supporting projects funded through cooperative, because some of the supporting projects have had even lots of different impacts in lots of different ways. But the blueprint itself is a resource and forum and things like that. So some things that have happened so far: more resources for fire and longleaf restoration, increased collaboration on aquatic connectivity, supporting info for land protection and restoration proposals. And so that also results in improving things like hunting, fishing, and recreational access, overall ecosystem level improvements. More awareness of cultural resources through some of the blueprint workshops and other outreach. So this is some of the actions coming from like the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Plan and others. and also increase collaboration and landscape scale coordination through blueprint processes. And that's something that comes up in a lot of these different plans about more collaboration and bigger scale coordination on doing conservation decisions. So those are a few places where we already have specific completed blueprint uses that we can track down to those types of things. The next thing is like, here are some things the blueprint could help soon. So things where we haven't really, things like best locations and impacts of living shorelines, we've got some stuff in the works where that could help soon. Connections with urban communities, making some good progress on that, but some things in the works that could really help. Integration of coastal actions and resilient marine planning. So those are things where we don't have as many like complete blueprint uses, but some good stuff in the works, so good to see progress in the next while. And then there are some things where the blueprint has had less impact so far, despite efforts and great projects and things like that. So exotic invasive species control doesn't have projects, have pieces on that, but the blueprint itself, we have had major things. In-stream flow policy, great opportunities, great stuff, but the blueprint is sort of a prioritization and document. Some of the projects have helped with flow policy, but not the blueprint itself. And education and awareness for the general public. We haven't really been using the blueprint or State of South Atlantic or those things much for the general public, more for the conservation community. So those are things where it's had less impact. Probably will have less impact in the next year or so, kind of near term stuff. So that'll give you a flavor of what kind of, what business as usual is getting us so far. It might get us in the near future. So I want to return to these potential blueprint approaches. This idea of do we keep going with the current approach? Do we diversify more on actions? Do we increase the focus? Maybe we get more bang for our buck in just a few actions, but then also we lose out on opportunities. So this is the next question I wanted to take the group's temperature with. So we're going to go ahead and give you a new poll question here. Second here.
Bear with me.
So we're going to give you a new poll question. And so before we give you this poll question, just wanted to stop and see how, if there are any questions about that. I think I just saw in the chat box there might be a good public education opportunity for next spring. So maybe there's, in the next feature, some public education opportunities as well. We have has actually been used a little bit in public outreach for the Francis Marion Forest Plan. So there might be some opportunities in that as well. So again, this is a good example of a situation. Well, we could try to help on that, or we could focus more on others. So any questions on that before we put up a quick poll around these three different types of approaches for that long set of actions I was just showing you?
All right, I'm going to go ahead and open it, and another 2 minutes to choose your preference. And if you do want to jump in with a question while the voting window's open, don't be shy. About a minute left. Seconds. Pressure's on. Maybe I'm getting too into this. I don't know. 60% finished.
Not into it enough. We didn't have final countdown ready.
I know.
Next time.
Yeah.
Next
Lesson
time.
learned for the next time. 4, 3, 2, 1. All right.
Now, also, the other interesting thing on the last poll, there were 4 people that didn't vote, and FYI, they were basically all the staff here. I was like, 4 people are just slacking. I was like, oh no, wait.
Oh, that's us.
That's us. That's me and Amy and Mallory and all that stuff.
All right.
Someone influence the results here.
All right. So you guys should be able to see the results now.
Yeah.
Put those up.
Yeah. So we got a good balance here. A little bit less on the diversify side, and then a mix between current approach and increased focus, which is good. I think that gives us a good weighted balance.
That's a distinct trend line.
Yeah, and so that might give us some stuff to think about either in this version or a future version, or maybe the next year, to think about maybe there's a split hybrid approach where we kind of have a tier 1, tier 2 thing where we're still open to stuff, but maybe we put more effort in a couple of things. So that is very helpful.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, so thanks so much for all the input. For folks that were not sure, if you have other thoughts, other plans you'd like to see incorporated in the implementation strategy, feel free to send it along. We'll keep working on tweaking and improving it, and then we'll see. Still, fingers crossed, hope to have a sort of final version out by the end of the year.
Yeah, and so if you are interested in diving in more deeply, I'd recommend that you check out Rua's blog, which is featured on the homepage of the South Atlantic LCC website right now, that has a link to the Google Doc that we were showing, or you can email him feedback. Feedback's going to be most helpful in the upcoming week. We're hoping to close that out, I believe, the 28th of September.
Perfect.
So I want to blaze through in our last couple of minutes just a quick preview of what you have to look forward to on next month's web forum. We're going to be hearing from Ricky White with NatureServe about a project that was funded by the South Atlantic LCC, addressing the need to coordinate monitoring of prescribed fire impact across the South Atlantic region and improve tracking of the actual spatial extent of prescribed fire that's being put on the ground. So this is a project that's coordinating with key partners to build off NatureServe's rapid assessment protocols to propose some new fire monitoring protocols with an emphasis on open pine ecosystem. And then on the more project, the fire tracking side of things, this is going to be helping us understand how regional and local entities currently track their fire and suggest some options for consolidating the spatial extent information in a central sort of database so that we can really increase the number of fire treatments that are available as digitized polygons and get that spatial data that we all really need. So if you're interested in fire, longleaf, pine, definitely encourage you to tune in next month, same time, same place on the 19th of October. And then 2 quick updates from LCC staff. I just wanted to make everyone aware of a LCC network data management effort that the South Atlantic is participating in with the goal of really standardizing the project information and the final products that are available across all LCCs within the LCC network. As part of that, we're packaging up all of the public data that the South Atlantic LCC has ever produced into a bundle that can be hosted by any partners within the cooperative and is really accessible by anybody. And then lastly, just we're still on track for improving Blueprint 2.2. We hope that that'll be released in about a month. And that's not just improvements to the Blueprint data itself, but as well as some improvements to the viewer. Did you want to add anything on that? So stay tuned for the big reveal of Blueprint 2.2. We are on track for release of that this fall. And with that, here's how to get more involved in your cooperative community. As always, join the website, join the newsletter, talk to your staff. Anyone have any other questions or comments before we sign off? All right. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next month. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.